HOA cops broke my arm! My wife's terrified scream through the phone made my blood freeze instantly. The line went dead. My vision blurred with rage I hadn't felt since my federal days hunting the worst criminals. Someone wearing fake uniforms had just assaulted my wife in our own home, demanding money for violations that didn't exist. But they made one fatal mistake. They hurt the wrong man's family. What I did in the next 5 minutes would leave all three of them face down in the dirt and expose a conspiracy that reached deeper into our trusted community than anyone imagined. Comment below where you're watching from. This gets absolutely insane. I was reviewing quarterly security assessments for 3 different clients when Anna called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular note of concern I'd learned to recognize after 8 years of marriage. The morning light streamed through our suburban home's windows, casting familiar shadows across the hardwood floors we'd spent months refinishing when we moved here 8 months ago. What I didn't know then was that our peaceful life in Meadowbrook Estates was about to become a battlefield orchestrated by someone who should have been protecting our community instead of destroying it. Jack, can you come look at this email? Anna's nursing training had taught her to notice details that others missed, and her tone suggested she'd spotted something that didn't add up. I saved my work and walked to where she stood at the kitchen island, her tablet displaying what appeared to be an official HOA communication. The sender was listed as Diane Foster, Administrative Assistant, with a subject line that immediately raised red flags. Urgent compliance audit scheduled. Immediate response required. The email's formatting looked professional at first glance, complete with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA letterhead I'd seen on legitimate correspondence. But my FBI training had conditioned me to spot inconsistencies, and this message was riddled with them. The contact phone number used a 916 area code instead of the local 916 we'd expect for our region. The language alternated between overly formal legal terminology and casual phrasing that no administrative assistant would use in official correspondence. Most telling was the timestamp showing the email had been sent at 3:47 in the morning, hardly normal business hours for HOA communications. Anna had already begun her own investigation, cross-referencing the information with legitimate HOA documentation we'd received when we purchased the house. I called the main office number from our welcome packet, she explained, scrolling through her phone's call log. The receptionist said they don't have anyone named Diane Foster working there. She also mentioned that Linda Morrison, our HOA president, wasn't available and was handling some kind of special project. Anna's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. The receptionist seemed nervous when I asked about compliance audits. I studied the attached PDF that claimed to authorize an inspection of our property for various code violations. The document contained our correct address and basic property information, suggesting whoever created it had access to HOA records. However, the formatting inconsistencies continued throughout the document. Fonts changed mid-paragraph, margins were uneven, and the signature block referenced state statutes that didn't exist. My cyber investigation background had taught me that amateur document forgers often mixed legitimate information with fabricated authority to create believable deceptions. The inspection was supposedly that afternoon, backed by a grab bag of violations that didn't fit our property. It read less like policy and more like a setup. Anna continued her research while I examined the technical aspects of the email headers and attached documents. The metadata showed the PDF had been created using basic software available to any home computer user, not the professional document management systems legitimate HOAs typically employed. More suspicious was the discovery that the email account for Diane Foster had been created only 2 days earlier, according to the domain registration information I could access through my professional tools. What troubled me most was the personal information referenced in the email. The sender knew Anna worked at Regional Medical Center, that I ran a security consulting business from home, and that we'd recently completed renovations on our back patio. This level of detail suggested someone with access to HOA files had been researching our family specifically. The question was whether this represented targeted harassment, or if we were simply the latest victims in a broader scheme. By noon, Anna had compiled a comprehensive list of inconsistencies and red flags from the suspicious communication. Her nursing background had taught her to document everything methodically, and she'd created a timeline of events that revealed the depth of deception involved. The supposed compliance audit had no basis in our HOA's actual procedures, which required 30 days written notice for any property inspections. The violations listed in the document didn't correspond to any actual HOA covenants we could find in our governing documents. The breakthrough came when Anna discovered that Linda Morrison had personally requested a special compliance review for our specific address 3 weeks earlier. The HOA office receptionist had mentioned this detail during their second phone conversation, though she seemed reluctant to provide additional information. Anna's persistent but respectful questioning revealed that Mrs. Morrison had cited concerns about property value impacts and community standards, though no complaints had been filed by any neighbors. As afternoon approached, I found myself preparing for a confrontation I'd hoped to avoid in civilian life. My FBI experience had involved tracking sophisticated cyber criminals who used technology to hide their activities. This situation felt different, more personal and immediate. Someone with authority in our community was using that position to target my family specifically, and their methods suggested a level of planning that went beyond simple administrative error or misunderstanding. Anna and I discussed our options as we waited to see if anyone would actually appear for the supposed inspection. We could simply ignore the fake email and document the harassment for potential legal action later. We could confront whoever showed up with evidence of the deception and demand explanations. Or we could play along initially to gather more information about who was behind the scheme and what they hoped to accomplish. The decision was made for us when Anna spotted a white pickup truck with magnetic signs reading HOA Enforcement parked around the corner from our house. Through our security camera system, we could see 2 men in official-looking uniforms reviewing paperwork and occasionally pointing toward our property. One appeared to be photographing our house from various angles, while the other made notes on a clipboard. Their behavior suggested they were conducting surveillance rather than preparing for a legitimate inspection. What I didn't realize then was that this seemingly minor suburban dispute would evolve into something much larger and more dangerous. The person orchestrating these events had personal motivations that went far beyond HOA enforcement, and their willingness to escalate would soon put my wife in serious physical danger. By nightfall, the paper trail would point to someone no one in Meadowbrook Estates ever expected. I arrived home from my afternoon client meeting to find exactly what Anna and I had predicted, but seeing it unfold in person still triggered every instinct my FBI training had embedded in my nervous system. 2 men in crisp uniforms stood in our front yard, one measuring our fence line, while the other photographed our property from multiple angles. Their truck displayed professional-looking magnetic signs reading HOA Enforcement Division, and their clipboards bristled with official-seeming paperwork. What immediately struck me as wrong wasn't any single detail, but the accumulation of small inconsistencies that suggested an elaborate performance rather than legitimate municipal work. The first man, who introduced himself as Tony Brennan, carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. His uniform bore patches and badges that looked authentic from a distance, but up close revealed subtle formatting errors and incorrect badge numbers. His measuring tape was the kind available at any hardware store, not the precision instruments actual building inspectors used. More telling was his partner, Marcus Wilson, who seemed nervous and kept glancing toward the street, as if expecting trouble or monitoring for witnesses. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said, maintaining the calm, professional demeanor that had served me well during federal investigations. "My wife mentioned there might be some confusion about this inspection. Could you walk me through your authorization and explain exactly what violations you've identified?" The question was deliberately open-ended, designed to let them reveal the extent of their deception through their own responses. Tony's shoulders immediately tensed, and his posture shifted defensive, suggesting he had been dreading this exact conversation. Tony closed the distance until his clipboard brushed my chest using proximity and squared shoulders to force a reaction, then paused, testing whether I'd flinch or call his bluff. "Sir, we're following the compliance checklist directly from the HOA management company," he responded, flipping his clipboard like a shield while studying my stance and demeanor. His eyes measured me as much as they had measured our fence, apparently calculating whether I would fold under pressure or escalate to confrontation. Marcus raised the camera to inches from Anna's shoulder, firing rapid shots of her face and hands, as if our reactions were the violation he'd come to collect. The supposed violations they cited made no sense when examined against actual HOA regulations. Their paperwork didn't outline a lawful inspection so much as a script, a rushed checklist, a signature block with a countdown, and a demand to initial each remedy before we'd even been properly noticed. More telling, their script leaned on personal schedules. They had no right to hold Anna's shift. My client blocks weaponized to rush a signature before we could verify anything. Your perimeter exceeds regulation height on multiple measurement points, Marcus announced, tapping a line he'd highlighted twice on his fraudulent documentation. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone who delivered this same script multiple times to different victims. We'll document everything for the official report. Initial penalties start at $5,000, but if you cooperate fully with the remediation process, we can keep this from escalating to more serious enforcement measures. The $5,000 wasn't random. It was priced to sting, but not summon a lawyer proof they'd done invasive homework on our finances. I let them continue their performance while mentally cataloging every inconsistency and procedural violation they committed. The PDF they wanted me to sign contradicted itself on page 2 versus page 4 regarding inspection timelines. Reference codes jumped between different formatting styles mid-document. Most damaging was the notice date, which supposedly predated any contact with our address, meaning they'd logged violations days earlier without serving proper notification. According to this documentation, you recorded these violations several days ago, but never provided required notice. I observed keeping my voice level, while their confidence visibly wavered. Marcus began rocking on his heels like someone wearing boots that were too small, while Tony's jaw tightened as his eyes bounced between my face and the paperwork he knew wouldn't survive careful scrutiny. I wasn't looking for perfect documentation, since I understood legitimate municipal work sometimes involved procedural shortcuts. What I was looking for were the unconscious behavioral indicators that revealed deception and guilty knowledge. They provided all the evidence I needed, without saying a word through their nervous body language and defensive reactions. Anna emerged from our house at that moment, with her phone in hand, wearing the particular expression she gets when her investigative research has uncovered something significant that will change the entire situation. Her nursing background had taught her to gather evidence methodically, and she'd spent the afternoon building a comprehensive case against whoever was orchestrating this harassment campaign. The clean chain of screenshots she'd compiled would prove invaluable in documenting the systematic nature of the deception. I reverse searched that Diane Foster email address while you were in your meeting, Anna announced, holding up her documentation with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a complex puzzle. The email account was created yesterday morning. The domain sits behind a privacy proxy with mismatched name servers and an administrative phone number that routes to a disconnected voice messaging system. I've also spoken directly with our real HOA president by phone, and she personally confirmed they've never authorized any compliance audits in our neighborhood. They absolutely don't contract with outside enforcement companies for property violations. The two fake officers exchanged a quick worried glance that confirmed every suspicion my federal training had raised since first encountering their unprofessional operation. Their performance had been convincing enough to fool most suburban homeowners, but they hadn't prepared for targets who possessed investigative experience and the persistence to verify their claims through official channels. The nervous energy radiating from both men suggested they were operating outside their comfort zone and hadn't planned for this level of scrutiny. Marcus drifted toward Anna with the lens. Tony tried to box me in. "Mrs. Morrison expects full compliance," he said, a threat dressed as procedure. They left with promises to review our case thoroughly and be in touch soon regarding next steps. But their departure felt more like a strategic retreat than completion of legitimate municipal business. Anna immediately began documenting everything we'd observed, photographed their vehicle and license plate, and started researching the company name displayed on their truck. What we discovered would prove that this harassment campaign was both more personal and more dangerous than either of us had initially realized. I was wrapping up my final client meeting of the day when my phone erupted with Anna's panicked voice, the terror in her tone instantly activating every emergency protocol my federal training had drilled into my nervous system. "Jack, they're back. Linda Morrison is with them." Her words came in rapid bursts, punctuated by heavy breathing that suggested she was moving quickly through our house. "They're demanding the money now. They won't leave." The background noise included aggressive male voices and what sounded like someone pounding on our front door with increasing intensity and hostility. "They're saying I have to sign papers right now or they'll call the sheriff." Anna continued, her voice rising, as the situation clearly escalated beyond verbal intimidation. "Please don't touch me," she suddenly shouted, apparently addressing someone other than me. The sound that followed made my blood freeze, a stumbling crash, followed by Anna crying out in genuine pain, then the unmistakable noise of a phone hitting a hard surface. The line went dead, leaving me with nothing but the echo of my wife's distress and the certainty that our suburban harassment had just transformed into something far more dangerous. I abandoned my meeting without explanation, grabbing my keys while speed dialing 911 during my sprint to the parking garage. The 5-minute drive from my downtown office to Meadowbrook Estates became a calculated risk assessment between reaching Anna quickly and avoiding a traffic accident that would delay my arrival even further. My hands gripped the steering wheel with the muscle memory of high-stress federal operations, while my mind ran through tactical scenarios and legal considerations. The dispatcher confirmed they were sending units to our address, but suburban response times meant I would likely arrive first. Pulling into our driveway, I immediately assessed the scene with the systematic approach my FBI background had made instinctive. Anna sat on our front steps, cradling her left arm against her body, tears streaming down her face, while she spoke rapidly to someone on her phone. Her arm was positioned at an unnatural angle that clearly indicated serious injury, and her pale complexion suggested she was fighting shock. Tony and Marcus were hastily loading their equipment into their truck, while a woman I didn't recognize sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, apparently coordinating their rapid departure. "They pushed me when I tried to get my phone back to call you," Anna explained through gritted teeth as I knelt beside her to examine her injury without causing additional damage. Her forearm showed obvious deformation, consistent with a broken radius or ulna, and her fingers were already beginning to swell. The positioning suggested she'd instinctively tried to break her fall when they shoved her backward down our front steps. Linda Morrison was directing them the whole time. She told them to take my phone and make me sign papers saying we'd pay the fine. The woman in the truck's driver's seat was presumably Linda Morrison, our HOA president, though I'd never met her face-to-face during our 8 months in the neighborhood. She appeared to be arguing with Tony and Marcus through the passenger window, gesturing frantically as they threw their fake enforcement equipment into the truck bed. Her presence transformed this from random criminal activity into coordinated harassment by someone in a position of community trust and authority. The realization that our own HOA leadership was orchestrating attacks against residents sent my anger to levels I hadn't experienced since my federal days. "I'm going after them," I told Anna after confirming the ambulance was en route and she had successfully contacted emergency services. Mrs. Williams saw them head toward Miller Road. Our neighbor called from her window, pointing in the direction the truck had traveled. The construction site 2 blocks away would provide the perfect location for them to change license plates or transfer to a different vehicle standard procedure for criminals attempting to avoid identification after committing assault. My pursuit training from federal law enforcement guided my approach to the construction site, where I found their truck parked behind a pile of building materials, apparently thinking the location would provide concealment from passing traffic. Tony and Marcus were indeed changing their license plates, while Linda Morrison stood nearby, clearly agitated and arguing with them about how far their harassment campaign had escalated. "This was supposed to be intimidation, not assault," I heard her saying, as I positioned my vehicle to block their only exit route. "You hurt my wife," I announced as I approached their group, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "We need to settle this right now." Tony immediately grabbed a tool from the truck bed and approached me aggressively, apparently deciding that violence was their best option for escaping the situation. His movement triggered defensive protocols I'd hoped never to use again in civilian life, but protecting Anna and ensuring these criminals faced consequences became my only priorities. Tony's aggressive approach with the tool activated muscle memory from federal tactical training, and I used defensive maneuvers to redirect his momentum rather than meeting force with force. His balance shifted as I sidestepped his charge, and he fell backward into a dirt pile that had been excavated for foundation work. Marcus tried to intervene but stepped onto loose gravel that couldn't support his weight, causing him to slip and tumble face first into the muddy construction area, where recent rain had created treacherous footing. Linda Morrison panicked as she watched her hired muscle fail to intimidate me, and she attempted to run toward the street to escape the situation. Her high heels weren't designed for navigating construction debris, and she tripped over scattered building materials, landing face first in the dirt beside the foundation excavation. All 3 of them ended up on the ground, in various states of muddy defeat, exactly as the confrontation had needed to end. Rather than continuing any physical confrontation, I immediately called the police to report the assault on Anna and the attempted intimidation by these 3 individuals. My federal training had taught me that evidence and legal procedures would provide more lasting justice than any physical retribution I might deliver in the heat of the moment. The construction site security cameras had captured the entire encounter, providing independent verification of their criminal behavior and my defensive response. Within minutes, sirens approached from multiple directions as law enforcement, emergency medical services, and fire department units responded to what had become a multi-agency incident. Tony and Marcus remained on the ground, apparently more concerned about potential criminal charges than their muddy clothing and bruised egos. Linda Morrison attempted to maintain her dignity while covered in construction site dirt, but her authority as HOA president wouldn't protect her from assault and conspiracy charges. The responding officers quickly established that Anna's broken arm constituted felony assault, while the coordinated harassment campaign represented criminal conspiracy involving multiple parties. Linda Morrison's presence at the scene as a directing participant elevated the charges from simple assault to abuse of authority and elder targeting, since several of their previous victims had been senior citizens. What had begun as suburban harassment had escalated into serious criminal activity with substantial legal consequences. As I provided my statement to the investigating officers, I realized this confrontation represented only the beginning of a much larger investigation into systematic abuse of HOA authority and targeted harassment of vulnerable residents. The evidence we'd gathered would prove essential in exposing the full scope of their criminal enterprise and ensuring they faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The emergency room at Regional Medical Center became an unexpected staging area for what would evolve into a comprehensive criminal investigation, though at the time I was focused entirely on Anna's medical condition and the growing realization that we'd been targeted by people we should have been able to trust. Anna's x-rays revealed a clean break of both her radius and ulna, requiring immediate surgical intervention to properly align the bones and prevent permanent nerve damage. The orthopedic surgeon explained that her instinctive attempt to break her fall had actually minimized what could have been catastrophic injury to her wrist and hand. Detective Rivera arrived while Anna was being prepped for surgery, her professional demeanor immediately establishing the seriousness with which law enforcement was treating our case. Linda Morrison had been arrested at the construction site, but was already claiming the entire incident represented a massive misunderstanding, orchestrated by overzealous contractors she'd hired in good faith. Her story positioned her as another victim of Tony and Marcus's deception, someone who had been manipulated into participating in activities she never would have approved if she'd understood their true nature. Mrs. Morrison insists she believed Tony Brennan and Marcus Wilson were legitimate enforcement contractors recommended by another HOA in the county. Detective Rivera explained while reviewing the preliminary evidence we'd provided. She claims she hired them to conduct routine compliance checks and had no knowledge they would use intimidation tactics or physical force against residents. The detective's tone suggested she'd heard similar deflection strategies from other suspects, and her questions indicated she was building a case based on evidence rather than accepting convenient explanations. However, Linda Morrison's phone records told a dramatically different story than her claims of innocence and manipulation. The digital evidence revealed 47 separate communications between her personal cell phone and a number registered to Jake Morgan Consulting over the previous 6 months. Text message contents showed explicit coordination of harassment activities, including specific instructions about which residents to target and what psychological pressure tactics would be most effective against each household. The most damaging evidence came from text exchanges that demonstrated Linda Morrison's personal animosity toward my family specifically. "Make Mitchell family pay for stealing my contract" appeared in a message sent 3 weeks earlier, followed by detailed instructions about exploiting Anna's work schedule and my consulting business vulnerabilities. Other messages revealed that she'd specifically requested Tony and Marcus to make them understand what happens when outsiders interfere with established community leadership. Detective Rivera's investigation had uncovered Linda Morrison's motivation through public records that painted a picture of professional jealousy and financial desperation driving her criminal behavior. 6 months earlier, she'd submitted a proposal for a comprehensive security assessment contract with our local business district, competing directly against my consulting firm for what represented a $15,000 engagement. Her proposal had been rejected in favor of mine based on my federal law enforcement credentials and specialized cybersecurity expertise that her small consulting business couldn't match. The rejection had apparently triggered a downward spiral that destroyed both her professional confidence and her financial stability. Her small consulting business had been struggling for years, competing against larger firms with better credentials and more established reputations. Losing the security contract to a newcomer in the community represented not just financial disappointment, but a personal humiliation that she'd been unable to process appropriately. Her position as HOA president had become her only remaining source of authority and income. Linda Morrison's systematic research into our family revealed the depth of her obsession with undermining my success and reputation. Security footage from the HOA office showed her accessing residential files and researching personal information about multiple families, including our VA loan documentation, medical insurance details, and employment records. She'd printed photographs of our property from various angles and created what appeared to be a surveillance timeline tracking our daily routines and potential vulnerabilities. The wall chart discovered in her home office during the police search warrant execution looked like something from a stalker's obsession room rather than legitimate community administration. Our family's schedule, Anna's nursing shifts, my client meeting times, and our weekend activities had been meticulously documented over a period of several weeks. Red circles marked what she apparently considered optimal times for harassment activities, when we'd be most vulnerable to intimidation and least likely to have witness support. Her targeting hadn't been limited to our family, as Detective Rivera's investigation revealed a broader pattern of harassment affecting multiple households throughout Meadowbrook Estates. The elderly Patterson family had been forced to pay $3,000 for alleged mailbox height violations that didn't exist in any official HOA regulations. Jennifer Collins, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children, had been intimidated about yard maintenance standards that exceeded anything specified in our community covenants. The Thompson family, another military household, had endured harassment about their flag display that violated no federal, state, or local regulations, but had generated constant complaints and threats from Linda Morrison's fake enforcement contractors. The pattern revealed that she'd been systematically targeting households she perceived as vulnerable, including elderly residents, single parents, and military families who might be reluctant to challenge authority figures or engage in prolonged legal disputes. Linda Morrison's method involved using her legitimate access to HOA records to identify residents who would be most susceptible to intimidation and least likely to verify her claims through independent research. She'd studied our financial situations, family circumstances, and psychological profiles to craft personalized harassment campaigns designed to maximize stress while minimizing the risk of organized resistance. Her approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques. The financial trail showed that Linda Morrison had paid Tony Brennan and Marcus Wilson $500 for each enforcement visit they conducted on her behalf, funding their activities through her depleted consulting business accounts. The payments were disguised as contractor fees for community compliance services, but the timing and amounts directly correlated with harassment incidents affecting specific households. She'd spent over $6,000 orchestrating a campaign of intimidation against her own neighbors. Detective Rivera's investigation revealed that Linda Morrison's escalation pattern had followed a predictable trajectory from targeting the most vulnerable residents toward confronting those capable of fighting back. She had started with elderly homeowners who were likely to pay fraudulent fines rather than challenge authority, then moved to single parents who were too overwhelmed to research her claims, and finally escalated to military families who represented personal triggers related to her professional jealousy and resentment. My family had been selected as her final target specifically because my federal law enforcement background posed the greatest threat to her operations continuation. Her text messages revealed awareness that I possessed investigative skills that could expose her entire scheme, but her obsession with revenge had overridden her survival instincts. She'd convinced herself that discrediting me would somehow restore her professional reputation and validate her authority within the community. The realization that our trusted community leader had orchestrated systematic harassment of vulnerable neighbors transformed my anger into determination to ensure comprehensive legal consequences. Linda Morrison hadn't just committed crimes against our family, she'd violated the fundamental trust that makes suburban communities possible. Her abuse of authority had endangered elderly residents, terrorized working families, and corrupted the democratic processes that govern homeowner associations. Anna's surgery at Regional Medical Center revealed complications that transformed her injury from a temporary setback into a potential career-ending catastrophe, fundamentally altering the stakes of our confrontation with Linda Morrison and her criminal associates. The orthopedic surgeon discovered nerve damage that hadn't been visible on the initial X-rays, explaining that the impact from her fall had compressed crucial nerves responsible for fine motor control in her dominant hand. For someone whose nursing career depended on precise movements for starting intravenous lines, administering injections, and performing delicate patient care procedures, this represented devastation beyond simple bone healing. The physical therapy process became a daily reminder of how Linda Morrison's vendetta had damaged our family in ways that extended far beyond financial harassment. Anna struggled with basic tasks she'd performed effortlessly throughout her nursing career, her frustration mounting as simple procedures like opening medication bottles or manipulating medical equipment became exercises in adaptation and determination. Watching her fight tears during rehabilitation sessions while relearning fundamental skills triggered protective instincts that made me want to pursue every possible legal remedy against those responsible for her suffering. Our medical bills mounted rapidly as Anna's treatment required specialized hand therapy and occupational rehabilitation that her insurance company was questioning under their assault victim protocols. The insurance adjuster seemed more interested in determining fault and limiting liability than ensuring Anna received appropriate care for her injuries. Their investigation process required extensive documentation and multiple medical opinions, creating additional stress during a period when Anna needed to focus entirely on her recovery and potential return to nursing. Community pressure emerged from an unexpected direction as approximately half of our neighbors began blaming me for escalating a situation they believed should have been resolved through compromise and accommodation. Linda Morrison was an excellent HOA president for 2 years, became a common refrain from residents who apparently preferred maintaining neighborhood harmony over confronting criminal behavior. Anonymous notes appeared on our door, suggesting that veterans sometimes experienced anger management issues and recommending counseling services for what they characterized as my overreaction to routine HOA enforcement. The psychological manipulation campaign Linda Morrison orchestrated from her jail cell demonstrated the same systematic approach she'd used in her original harassment scheme. She made collect calls to neighbors throughout Meadowbrook Estates, positioning herself as a dedicated community leader who had been railroaded by a violent veteran with anger control problems. Her version of events portrayed Tony and Marcus as legitimate contractors she'd hired in good faith, while characterizing my defensive response as unprovoked assault against workers performing authorized community duties. I was simply trying to maintain property values and community standards, became Linda Morrison's standard explanation to anyone willing to listen to her calls from county jail. She emphasized her 2 years of volunteer service as HOA president, her dedication to improving neighborhood aesthetics, and her shock at discovering that the contractors she'd hired were using inappropriate methods. Her narrative carefully omitted her personal research into our family's vulnerabilities, her explicit instructions for harassment activities, and her presence during the assault that broke Anna's arm. Some neighbors found Linda Morrison's victim narrative convincing, particularly those who'd never experienced her harassment personally and had no understanding of the systematic nature of her criminal enterprise. Military people sometimes have anger issues related to their service. Became another recurring theme in conversations Anna overheard at the grocery store or during neighborhood encounters. The community's willingness to accept this stereotype, rather than examining evidence of criminal behavior, added psychological burden to Anna's physical recovery process. My professional reputation suffered collateral damage, as Linda Morrison's supporters spread rumors about my consulting business and questioned whether someone with apparent anger management problems should be advising other organizations about security matters. 3 potential clients canceled preliminary meetings after receiving what they described as anonymous warnings about my involvement in neighborhood disputes and assault charges. The financial impact compounded our stress as Anna's medical expenses increased while my business income decreased. The lowest point came when Anna suggested we consider accepting the $25,000 settlement offer that Linda Morrison's attorney had proposed through intermediaries. My nursing career might be permanently damaged, Anna said during one particularly difficult physical therapy session where her progress had plateaued. Your business reputation is being destroyed by rumors and innuendo. Maybe Linda Morrison is right that we should have handled this differently. The defeat in Anna's voice represented everything I'd sworn to prevent when I'd pursued those criminals to the construction site. Anna's suggestion that I might have overreacted to the harassment triggered self-doubt that I hadn't experienced since transitioning from federal law enforcement to civilian consulting work. Federal investigations involved clear authority structures and defined procedures for pursuing criminals, while suburban disputes required navigation of social dynamics and community relationships that were far more complex. Perhaps my training had conditioned me to see criminal conspiracy where others saw simple misunderstanding and poor communication. The turning point came when Mrs. Patterson, the 83-year-old widow who lived 3 houses down from us, approached Anna during one of her walks around the neighborhood for rehabilitation exercise. Mrs. Patterson had seemed supportive of Linda Morrison throughout the community controversy, so Anna expected another lecture about conflict resolution and compromise. Instead, the elderly woman revealed information that completely reframed our understanding of Linda Morrison's criminal activities and their impact on vulnerable residents. Linda Morrison demanded $3,000 from me last month for mailbox height violations that don't exist in any HOA regulations. Mrs. Patterson confided, her voice shaking with anger rather than age. She sent those same men to my house with official-looking paperwork and threats about property seizure if I didn't pay immediately. I used my grocery money for that month because I was terrified they'd take my house. The revelation that Linda Morrison had been systematically targeting elderly residents with fraudulent fines eliminated any remaining doubt about the criminal nature of her activities. Mrs. Patterson's disclosure triggered a flood of similar revelations from other neighbors who'd been intimidated into silence by Linda Morrison's threats and the community's pressure to avoid conflict. The scope of her criminal enterprise extended far beyond what Detective Rivera's initial investigation had uncovered, involving multiple households and thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines collected through intimidation and deception. Our confrontation with her fake enforcement contractors had apparently prevented the continuation of systematic elder abuse throughout Meadowbrook Estates. The realization that Linda Morrison's criminal activities had been ongoing for months, affecting vulnerable residents who lacked the resources or knowledge to resist her harassment, transformed my perspective on our legal obligations and moral responsibilities. This wasn't simply about seeking justice for Anna's assault or protecting our family's reputation. It was about stopping a predator who'd been systematically exploiting the trust and authority inherent in community leadership positions to victimize those least able to defend themselves. Anna's recovery took on new meaning, as we understood that her courage in questioning Linda Morrison's fake contractors had exposed a criminal enterprise that might have continued indefinitely without intervention. Her broken arm had become a symbol of resistance against abuse of authority, and her determination to return to nursing represented something larger than personal healing. Mrs. Patterson's revelation about Linda Morrison's systematic targeting of elderly residents provided the catalyst I needed to transform my anger into methodical investigation, applying the digital forensic skills I'd developed during my FBI career to expose the full scope of her criminal enterprise. My home office became a command center where I assembled evidence from multiple sources, cross-referencing financial records, communication logs, and witness testimonies to build an airtight case that would ensure comprehensive legal consequences for everyone involved in the harassment campaign. The digital investigation began with Linda Morrison's social media presence, where my cybersecurity expertise revealed a treasure trove of deleted posts and private messages that painted a clear picture of her growing resentment towards successful newcomers in our community. Using specialized recovery software, I retrieved posts she'd made complaining about unqualified contractors taking work from established local businesses, and angry comments about my security consulting firm winning contracts that she believed belonged to long-term community members. The timeline showed her harassment campaign had been planned for months. Social media archaeology revealed Linda Morrison's psychological state during the period leading up to our harassment, demonstrating escalating anger and increasingly irrational thinking about perceived injustices in her professional and personal life. Her deleted posts referenced conversations with other frustrated small business owners about the unfairness of competing against people with federal law enforcement credentials and her growing conviction that newcomers were deliberately undermining established community leadership structures. Physical evidence collection required systematic documentation of similar harassment incidents affecting other households throughout Meadowbrook Estates, revealing patterns that transformed isolated complaints into evidence of coordinated criminal activity. I visited every family Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, photographing fake violation notices that shared identical formatting errors, font inconsistencies, and fabricated reference codes. Tony Brennan and Marcus Wilson had used the same white pickup truck identical fake uniforms, and nearly identical scripts for intimidating residents across multiple properties. The financial documentation showed a fixed per-visit cash payout to Tony and Marcus laundered through her consulting accounts as community compliance work, each withdrawal lining, up to the day a household reported a knock. Bank records revealed she'd withdrawn over $6,000 in cash over a 3-month period, with withdrawal dates corresponding exactly to reported harassment incidents throughout the neighborhood. The correlation between her payments and criminal activities provided clear evidence of conspiracy and coordination. My garage was transformed into an evidence assembly area where I created comprehensive visual documentation that would be essential for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Large bulletin boards displayed photographs, documents, and timeline charts showing the systematic nature of Linda Morrison's operation. Maps of Meadowbrook Estates marked every targeted household with colored pins indicating the type of harassment they'd experienced and the financial impact of fraudulent fines and intimidation. The map didn't show categories, it showed people. A yellow pin sat on Mrs. Patterson's porch, beside a mailbox citation time-stamped 3 minutes after her caregiver left. 2 streets over, Jennifer's door hanger read at 10:42 p.m., the exact hour she sprints home from her second shift. The Thompsons' folder held a dawn photo of their flag and a typed note, "Non-conforming display escalate." Financial trail analysis showed the broader economic impact of Linda Morrison's criminal enterprise, with total theft exceeding $15,000 through fraudulent fines collected from 8 different households over 6 months. The Patterson family's $3,000 payment for non-existent mailbox violations represented the largest single theft, while smaller amounts ranging from $500 to $1,500 had been extracted from other families through various fabricated violations and intimidation tactics. The Thompson family had endured particularly systematic harassment related to their American flag display, which violated no federal, state, or local regulations, but had generated constant complaints and threats from Linda Morrison's contractors. Military families represented personal triggers for Linda Morrison, apparently reminding her of the federal credentials that had given me competitive advantages in the consulting market. Her targeting of veterans demonstrated that her criminal activities were motivated by psychological resentment, rather than simple financial opportunity. Jennifer Collins, the single mother working 2 jobs to support her children, had been intimidated about yard maintenance standards that exceeded anything specified in our community covenants or local ordinances. Linda Morrison had researched Jennifer's work schedule and childcare arrangements, timing harassment visits for periods when Jennifer would be most stressed and least able to verify claims or seek assistance. The sophistication of her psychological manipulation techniques suggested experience with predatory behavior. Linda Morrison's escalation pattern followed a predictable trajectory that my federal training had taught me to recognize in criminal enterprises. She'd begun with elderly targets who were most likely to comply without resistance, progressed to single parents who were too isolated to organize effective opposition, and finally escalated to military families who represented both personal triggers and potential threats to her operation's continuation. Each success had apparently emboldened her to attempt more aggressive harassment. The confrontation with Linda Morrison's husband occurred when he arrived at our house seeking to defend his wife's reputation, though his approach remained upset but not violent throughout our interaction. "You're destroying my wife's reputation with false accusations and destroying our family," he said, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose world had been turned upside down by revelations about his spouse's criminal activities. I responded by calmly showing him the evidence board I'd assembled, explaining that documentation rather than accusations would determine the truth. The transformation in Linda Morrison's husband's demeanor was immediate and devastating as he reviewed photographs, financial records, and witness statements that revealed the systematic nature of his wife's criminal enterprise. His emotional breakdown wasn't angry, but rather the profound grief of someone realizing that his marriage had been built on deception and that his children would grow up with a mother who'd chosen criminal activity over family stability. "I had no idea she was doing any of this," he repeated several times while studying evidence of her harassment campaign. The separation papers he filed the following week demonstrated that Linda Morrison's criminal activities had destroyed not only her victim's sense of security, but also her own family's foundation. Her children would face the social stigma of having a mother convicted of elder abuse and conspiracy, while her husband would need to rebuild his reputation in a community where he'd unknowingly benefited from his wife's criminal activities. The ripple effects of her choices extended far beyond the households she'd directly targeted. The evidence package I assembled would prove essential for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. But more importantly, it demonstrated to our community that systematic criminal activity had been occurring under the guise of legitimate HOA enforcement. The visual documentation made it impossible for Linda Morrison's supporters to continue characterizing her activities as simple misunderstandings or administrative errors, forcing them to confront the reality that they'd been defending someone who'd systematically victimized vulnerable neighbors. The emergency HOA meeting I'd requested drew the largest attendance in Meadowbrook Estates history, with over 60 residents packing into our community center for what many expected would be a routine discussion about neighborhood disputes, but which I intended to transform into a comprehensive exposure of Linda Morrison's criminal enterprise. The visual tension was immediately apparent as families positioned themselves on different sides of the room, reflecting the community divisions that Linda Morrison's manipulation campaign had created between her supporters and those who'd experienced her harassment firsthand. Linda Morrison arrived with her attorney, apparently expecting community support to validate her victim narrative and discredit my accusations as the overreaction of an unstable veteran with anger management issues. Her polished appearance and confident demeanor suggested she'd convinced herself that her 2 years of volunteer service as HOA president would outweigh evidence of criminal activity in the minds of neighbors who valued community harmony over individual justice. Her lawyer's presence indicated she understood the seriousness of the criminal charges, but believed public opinion could influence the legal proceedings. When the first slide hit the screen, the room answered chairs scraped. A few gasps rose and someone whispered from the back, "That's my notice." Hands went up not to speak, but to trace dates and signatures they recognized as their own. The systematic nature of Linda Morrison's criminal activities became undeniable when presented through comprehensive visual evidence. The progression of evidence began with the fake violation notices that had been served to 8 different households, demonstrating identical formatting errors, fabricated reference codes, and impossible compliance timelines that proved coordination rather than legitimate municipal enforcement. Bank records displayed on the projector showed Linda Morrison's cash withdrawals corresponding exactly to reported harassment incidents, while phone logs revealed her coordination with Tony Brennan and Marcus Wilson throughout their intimidation campaign. Audio recordings of threatening phone calls that several residents had preserved provided the most damaging evidence against Linda Morrison's claims of innocence and good faith. The recordings captured her explicit instructions to Tony and Marcus about psychological pressure tactics, specific vulnerabilities to exploit in targeted households, and her personal animosity toward military families and successful newcomers in the community. Her voice on the recordings eliminated any possibility of claiming she'd been deceived by contractors acting independently. Victim testimonies began with Mrs. Patterson, whose quiet dignity and obvious vulnerability made her account of financial exploitation particularly powerful for community members who'd known her for decades. "I used my grocery money to pay Linda Morrison's fake fine because I was terrified they'd take my house," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of publicly admitting she'd been victimized by someone she'd trusted. Her testimony established the pattern of elder abuse that elevated Linda Morrison's crimes beyond simple harassment. Jennifer Collins described the psychological torture of being constantly threatened with child services reports and property seizure while working 2 jobs to support her children as a single mother. "Linda Morrison knew exactly when I'd be most vulnerable and stressed," Jennifer explained, timing her harassment for periods when I couldn't research her claims or seek help from others. Her testimony demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that Linda Morrison had employed against isolated residents. The Thompson family's experience with harassment about their American flag display revealed Linda Morrison's personal targeting of military households and her willingness to fabricate violations against patriotic symbols that were explicitly protected under federal law. Anna's testimony about her broken arm and potential career-ending injury provided the emotional climax that connected Linda Morrison's criminal activities to serious physical consequences and permanent damage to hardworking families. Linda Morrison's defense attorney had advised silence, but her psychological need to maintain her victim narrative and community standing overrode legal strategy as she watched her reputation crumble under the weight of evidence. "I worked for this community for 2 years without compensation," she declared, standing up defensively as residents examined photographs of her victims and documentation of her crimes. Her voice broke as she continued, "Jack Mitchell destroyed my livelihood and turned neighbors against each other. The desperation in Linda Morrison's voice became increasingly apparent as she attempted to justify criminal activities through appeals to community service and claims of good intentions. These people needed to follow proper procedures and maintain community standards. She insisted, apparently believing that property value concerns could excuse elder abuse and assault. Her lawyer's repeated attempts to quiet her were ignored as she pursued vindication through public opinion rather than legal defense. Linda Morrison's physical breakdown began when she gestured frantically while defending her actions, accidentally knocking over the evidence table and scattering photographs of her victims across the community center floor. The visual impact was devastating, as documentation of systematic elder abuse, financial exploitation, and assault evidence surrounded her while she stumbled backward from emotional overwhelm. Papers scattered dramatically, creating a symbolic representation of the community trust she'd destroyed through criminal activity. The community's response was swift and decisive, as residents witnessed Linda Morrison literally surrounded by evidence of her betrayal of vulnerable neighbors. Unanimous condemnation replaced the previous divisions, as even her former supporters recognized that systematic criminal activity couldn't be excused through appeals to community service or property value maintenance. The visual evidence had eliminated any reasonable doubt about her guilt and the predatory nature of her activities. Breaking down crying, Linda Morrison collapsed into her chair in complete defeat as the community voted unanimously to remove her from the HOA presidency immediately and demand criminal prosecution for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The vote to establish a victim support fund from HOA emergency reserves demonstrated the community's commitment to repairing the damage she'd caused to vulnerable residents. My election as interim HOA president reflected neighbors' recognition that federal law enforcement experience would be essential for preventing future abuse. The meeting concluded with residents signing a petition supporting criminal prosecution and civil litigation against Linda Morrison and her co-conspirators, while also committing to transparency reforms that would prevent future abuse of HOA authority. The community center that had been divided at the beginning of the evening was unified in demanding justice for victims and implementing safeguards to protect vulnerable residents from predatory leadership. Linda Morrison's public breakdown had accomplished what months of legal proceedings might not have achieved, demonstrating to every resident that her criminal activities represented calculated predation rather than administrative error or misunderstanding. Her emotional collapse in front of the community she'd victimized provided the cathartic resolution that victims needed to begin healing while establishing the foundation for comprehensive legal consequences. The transformation from community division to unified opposition against Linda Morrison's criminal enterprise proved that suburban democracy could function effectively when residents possessed accurate information about systematic abuse of authority. The visual evidence presentation had overcome manipulation and propaganda, allowing facts to speak more powerfully than emotional appeals or social pressure. The county courthouse proceedings that began 6 weeks after Linda Morrison's public breakdown represented the culmination of Detective Rivera's investigation and the comprehensive evidence package our community had assembled to ensure systematic criminal activity received appropriate legal consequences. The visual contrast between Linda Morrison in an Orange County jail jumpsuit and the polished HOA president who'd once commanded community respect demonstrated how thoroughly her criminal choices had destroyed both her authority and her family's foundation in Meadowbrook Estates. Linda Morrison faced multiple felony charges, including fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and assault through proxy, while Tony Brennan and Marcus Wilson were charged with assault, criminal impersonation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the financial evidence, recorded communications, and witness testimonies that had been meticulously documented throughout Detective Rivera's investigation and my evidence collection efforts. Media coverage brought additional scrutiny to HOA governance practices and elder protection protocols throughout the county. The victim impact statements provided the most emotionally powerful testimony in court proceedings that transformed abstract criminal charges into personal stories of financial exploitation, psychological trauma, and physical injury affecting vulnerable residents. Mrs. Patterson's testimony about using her grocery money to pay fraudulent fines demonstrated the real-world consequences of Linda Morrison's systematic targeting of elderly homeowners who trusted community authority figures and lacked resources to challenge fraudulent claims. Anna's testimony, while wearing the arm brace that would remain necessary for several more months, brought the physical consequences of Linda Morrison's criminal enterprise into sharp focus for judge and jury. Her description of potential career-ending nerve damage and the ongoing challenges of rehabilitation connected Linda Morrison's personal vendetta to permanent injury affecting someone whose professional life involved caring for others. The medical documentation supported Anna's testimony about the extensive physical therapy required to restore function to her dominant hand. Jennifer Collins's impact statement revealed the psychological warfare tactics Linda Morrison had employed against a single mother struggling to support her children through multiple jobs while maintaining her home according to legitimate community standards. The systematic timing of harassment to coincide with Jennifer's most vulnerable periods demonstrated sophisticated predatory behavior that went far beyond simple fraud or administrative error. Her testimony established the psychological manipulation component that elevated the charges beyond simple theft. The evidence presentation in court followed the same systematic approach I'd used during the community meeting, with visual documentation that made Linda Morrison's criminal coordination undeniable to judge and jury. Financial records showing her payments to Tony and Marcus correlated exactly with harassment incidents affecting specific households, while recorded communications contained explicit instructions for psychological pressure tactics and elder exploitation. The prosecution's case eliminated any reasonable doubt about systematic criminal activity. Defense testimony attempted to portray Linda Morrison as someone whose gambling addiction and financial desperation had driven her to poor decisions rather than calculated criminal behavior, but the evidence of systematic targeting and sophisticated psychological manipulation undermined claims of impaired judgment or situational desperation. Her detailed research into victim vulnerabilities and coordination of harassment activities demonstrated clear intent and careful planning rather than impulsive choices driven by addiction. Verdict: Linda, 18 months, 3 years probation and restitution. Tony and Marcus, 1 year plus service and no contact orders. Civil judgments covered Anna's care neighbor's fees and punitive damages that couldn't be dodged. Her house went to foreclosure for sale, lingered for months, while the HOA purged fake notices, seized uniforms, and impounded the truck. Anna's recovery exceeded medical expectations as her arm function returned to 90% of normal capacity after 6 months of intensive physical therapy and occupational rehabilitation. Her return to nursing included a new focus on advocacy for assault victims and development of protocols for recognizing and treating injuries resulting from domestic violence or elder abuse. Regional Medical Center created the Anna Mitchell Protocol for comprehensive care addressing both physical and psychological trauma affecting vulnerable patients. We codified transparency vendor checks and cameras. Neighbors asked me to stay on as HOA president, and my firm began helping other associations lock out fraud. We capped it with an annual community trust day. 1 year after Linda Morrison's criminal enterprise was exposed and dismantled, Meadowbrook Estates hosted a neighborhood barbecue where every family except the former Morrison household participated in celebrating community recovery and renewed trust. Anna played volleyball with full arm function, while I taught basic security awareness to neighbors who'd learned that suburban tranquility requires active protection rather than passive assumption, that authority figures deserve automatic trust and compliance. The empty lot where Linda Morrison's house had stood was converted into a community garden that served as a permanent reminder of how criminal choices could destroy families, while also demonstrating our neighborhood's commitment to creating something positive from the devastation her abusive authority had caused. Mrs. Patterson's embrace of Anna during the celebration carried the gratitude of vulnerable residents who'd been protected from ongoing exploitation through our willingness to confront criminal behavior. The final image that remained with me was the evidence board in my garage being replaced with family photographs as normal life resumed stronger than before, but vigilant against future threats.